Who am I? Have you ever asked this question? Maybe you feel completely lost in your ability to answer it. Maybe you know who you are, but you hate it. We're going to be talking about identity, and interestingly enough, there are actually two different things that we're talking about here, even though it sounds the same. We're talking about identity, and then we're also talking about who you are, which sound like the same thing, but they're actually different. So to explain what I mean by this, there is a term that I'm going to be using interchangeably throughout this with identity, which is ego. And when I say ego, I don't mean, somebody that has a big head like we often think about it. I mean the feeling of I, or the experience of I. And that I'll explain what the heck that means in a second. But to sort of give you an idea of why these two things, who you are and your ego or identity, are separate, I want to do an experiment with you. So let's say that you cut your hair. Would you still be you? Let's say that you had a different job than you have now. Would you still be you? Let's say that you got comprehensive plastic surgery and completely changed your appearance. Would you still be you? Right. So there is some fundamental you-ness that seems to transcend the things that we identify ourselves with. And that is the difference between who you are and your ego. Ego is the things that you identify with, whereas who you are is something constant. Which begs the question, who's that? Who am I if I am not all of these things that I identify with? I want to do another experiment, which is I want you to close your eyes and I want you to observe your mind. All of the thoughts, emotions, identifications, all of that stuff that goes on in your mind. Just sort of watch it go on. And then as you do that, ask yourself the question, who is it that is watching all of this? And the answer to that question is you. That's you. And you could even get real tricky about it and say, well, but I can watch the person that is watching all of it. But then the question becomes, who's watching all of that? And you can do this out for infinity, but there is always some part of you that is observing the rest of you. And this is something that yogis discovered thousands of years ago, which is that the observer and the observed cannot be the same thing, which sounds really obvious when you say it like that, but it gets trickier the more nuanced you get. So for instance, you could say, well, but I can look at my hand, but that's actually your eyes looking at your hand. Or you could say, well, but I can see myself in a mirror, and it's like, well, but that's you actually observing a reflection of yourself. You're not actually observing you. And so yogis had this realization where they said, oh, well, I can observe my mind, and therefore I must be separate from my mind in some way. Now, you could argue that, it's a different part of your mind observing, but whatever conclusion it is that you come to, the point is that the observer and the observed cannot be the same thing. And so this part of you that is always watching, that is you. That is the constant you that never changes, that fundamental you-ness that we were talking about earlier. Then the next question is, well, if I am just this observer part of me that doesn't have any sort of identification with anything, then what makes the difference between me and anyone else? Exactly. That is when people, on Instagram or whatever are saying, we're all one love, blah, blah, blah. That's what they're talking about. Or they're just parroting things that they've heard and they don't know what they're talking about. But for the people that do know what they're talking about, that's what they're talking about. That we are all connected by this sort of fundamental consciousness, let's call it, that we all share. So to explain this a little bit more, let me use an analogy. Let's say that, imagine for a second that you're sitting in a movie theater and you are watching the movie, and there could be all sorts of things happening during the movie that make you laugh, cry, all sorts of stuff. But then for a second, imagine that you forget that you're watching a movie. Imagine how much more devastating everything that happens in the movie would be. You know, somebody dies, it would be like they were really dying. And, you know, New York City gets destroyed, it would be like New York City actually got destroyed and you were in the middle of an apocalypse. Whereas when you are just watching the movie and you realize that you're just watching a movie, you may laugh, you may feel all sorts of emotions, but ultimately you know that you're just watching a movie. And the same thing is true with our identity, that we can identify, as we get attached and identify with our ego, what ends up happening is that everything becomes far more devastating because we no longer have that detachment. We no longer are sort of sitting in the seat of who we really are, which is this person that observes. So if we are only this person that observes, then why do anything? You know, why bother going through life when we don't really identify as anything in particular? Well, there's two parts to that. The first is that there is interplay between this thing that we're talking about, this fundamental you-ness, your soul, consciousness, whatever it is that you want to call it. There is interplay between that and our ego, our identity, our mind, all the thoughts and emotions. And that interplay that happens is part of what makes humanity so magic. This is a really nerdy analogy, but it's sort of like if you are at all familiar with invisible numbers, it is basically not invisible numbers, imaginary numbers. It is basically a concept that we made up in order to be able to account for something in mathematics that we wouldn't be able to account for otherwise. What's so cool about imaginary numbers is that they jump in and out of the real number system. Again, there's that interplay between this weird imaginary thing that we made up and actual numbers. And what is, and so that is, as we go throughout our life, that sort of dance that happens between who we really are, our consciousness, whatever the case, and our identity is part of the fun. And so it can be sort of fun to do these things. It's almost like putting on a costume and you get to try on the costume. The issue comes when we start to over-identify with that ego. And I'll get more into that in a second. But the second reason to do anything is this idea of dharma, which roughly translates to duty. And these are the things that you just sort of do. There's no thoughts, there's no emotions, there's no ego attached to it. It is just something that you feel called, pulled to do. It is an action. So a good example of this is when you think about a mother jumping in front of a car in order to protect her child. It's not like, normally that would be something that would be very scary and something that we would avoid at all costs, jumping in front of a car. But for a mother, it is thoughtless. She just does it because it is her dharma or her duty in that moment. And there are all sorts of things in our lives, as we go about our lives, that we just sort of feel called or pulled to do. The problem is that most of us get sort of pulled away from that. There's so much noise in our mind because of all of the stuff that we are inundated with that it is very hard to hear the sort of compass or dharma that naturally pulls us in a direction. And if you want to know more about the whole dharma topic, I have a whole video where I talk about sort of purpose, duty, dharma, this sort of general topic. It'll either pop up here or down in the description, depending on where you're watching this. But I want to come back to this idea of the danger that comes from attachment to your ego. Because think about if you were a teacher, okay? And you thought that your worth as a human being was because you provided this, valuable thing of being a teacher. Now let's say, and so you're pretty happy because you're you every day get to go to work and do this thing that you love and it gives you a sense of worth. But let's say that you get sick and you can no longer be a teacher. Now what? You are worthless as a human being because you can't do this thing that you love. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that you can't grieve the loss of that. I think that that is perfectly healthy and normal. But the trouble comes when our sense of self-worth gets tied up in this identity. Or another way to think about it is when we forget that this beautiful dance that happens between our true self, our consciousness, and our ego, when we forget that that is a dance and instead start to think of them as the same thing. So, another quick example of this is that when people have things like depression, a lot of that actually has to do with ego, has to do with identity. When you think about the way that somebody who is depressed thinks, when they think, I'm worthless, I'm such a loser, I'll never amount to anything, I'm never going to be able to change anything. All of these thoughts are I. It all has to do with ego. And again, that is not their fault by any means. It is conditioning that has happened throughout their lives that have taught them that they're supposed to act this way, that somehow their brain has learned that this is the best way to go about things. And as we start to pull out and identify the difference between these two things, this consciousness and ego, it makes it much easier to heal from that depression. So, with all of this being said, I want to give you sort of action item to take away with you as you go about your day-to-day life. Because for a lot of us, we have no awareness that we are in a movie theater, that we are watching a movie up on a screen, right? Because the consciousness is like the person in the movie theater, and then the screen is like our ego, identity, all that good stuff. It's all the stuff going on in our mind. And for a lot of us, we don't even realize that that's happening on a day-to-day basis. And so this exercise that we went through at the beginning, where I asked you to close your eyes and observe all the stuff that was going on in your mind and then ask yourself who's watching all of this, I just want you to keep that awareness with you as you go about your day-to-day. When you are experiencing things in your life and it feels really, really intense, see if you can take just a second to be like, oh yeah, who's watching all of this? Right. That's me. And see what difference that makes in your day-to-day experience. And so to circle back to sort of the original question that started this whole thing, who are you? You are the awareness beneath it all. And what is so cool and fun about life is that we get to try on all of these different costumes and identities and sort of play around with them. And that's kind of the joy of life, is that you can play around with all that stuff and it doesn't have to own you. It doesn't have to suck you in like it does with something like depression. If you feel really tangled up in your identity and don't know how to separate out from it, this video that I'll either pop up here or down in the description, depending on where you're watching this, goes into detail about a method that I use with clients that I call thread hunting that seems to really help. I hope that helps, and I'll see you later. Bye.